You ever see someone laugh at the exact moment they lose everything? The cake hit her cheek with a soft, wet sound that didn't belong in a room this polished, this expensive, this carefully curated for power. For half a second, time didn't move. Then the laughter came. Not loud at first. Just a ripple, a few scattered chuckles. But it spread quickly, infecting the room like permission had been granted. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, casting warm reflections across marble floors and champagne glasses. And in the center of it all stood Vanessa Cole, motionless. A thin layer of white frosting sliding slowly down the side of her face. The boy who threw it, Ethan Carter, no older than 16, grinned like he'd just landed the perfect joke. His hands still hovered in the air, fingers sticky, his confidence untouched by consequence. Across the room, his parents didn't rush forward, didn't scold, didn't correct. Instead, William Carter let out a low, amused breath, shaking his head as if indulging a harmless prank, while Linda Carter covered her smile with the edge of her champagne flute, eyes glinting with something colder than humor. Around them, guests in tailored suits and designer gowns exchanged looks that said more than words ever could. Some looked away, uncomfortable but silent. Others leaned in, entertained. Because this wasn't just a party. This was a room full of people who understood hierarchy without needing it explained, and in that moment they believed they knew exactly where Vanessa Cole stood. She didn't move right away. The music still played, soft jazz, something forgettable, but it no longer filled the space the same way. It felt distant now, like it was coming from another building entirely. A server paused mid-step near the edge of the room, unsure whether to approach. No one spoke to Vanessa. No one handed her a napkin. No one said her name. The frosting continued its slow path downward, tracing the line of her jaw, catching the light before slipping onto the collar of her tailored blazer. A blazer that cost more than most people in the room would ever admit spending on someone who looked like her. Ethan tilted his head slightly, watching for a reaction, expecting something loud, something emotional, something he could laugh at again. But Vanessa didn't give him that. Instead, she inhaled once, slow and steady, the kind of breath that doesn't ask for permission. Then she lifted her hand, not quickly, not sharply, and with a single deliberate motion, wiped the frosting from her cheek. The room quieted, not all at once, but enough to be noticed. Her fingers came away coated in white, and for a moment, she simply looked at them, as if confirming something only she could see. When she finally raised her eyes, she didn't look at the boy. She looked past him, at the guests, at the investors, at the people who had just decided, silently and collectively, that this moment was acceptable. Her gaze moved slowly, deliberately, memorizing faces the way someone memorizes exits in a burning building. William Carter shifted his weight, just slightly, sensing something change without understanding what it was. Linda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned, thinner now, more calculated. The laughter had died down, replaced by a tension that hung in the air like static before a storm. Vanessa reached for a napkin on a nearby table, unfolded it with precise, unhurried movements, and pressed it lightly against her cheek, dabbing away what remained. No anger, no embarrassment, just control. Absolute, unshakable control. Somewhere in the back of the room, someone cleared their throat. Another guest adjusted his cufflinks. The music kept playing, but no one was listening anymore. Because something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. And for the first time since the cake left the boy's hand, the room wasn't laughing. It was waiting. Vanessa did not rush to fill the silence, and that was the first thing that unsettled them, because people like the Carters were used to reactions, to noise, to others adjusting themselves quickly to restore comfort. But she did not offer them that relief. She simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, posture steady, as if nothing essential about her had been touched at all, and that absence of reaction began to stretch across the room in a way that made even the most confident guests shift slightly in place, unsure where to look or how to behave without a script. And it was in that quiet that her presence became something else entirely, not smaller as they had assumed, but heavier, more defined, like a structure finally revealed when the lights flicker back on. A man near the bar lowered his glass halfway, his eyes narrowing as recognition slowly replaced amusement, because he had seen her name before, not in gossip columns or party invitations, but in board reports, in quarterly earnings calls, in articles that spoke about market disruption and strategic acquisitions, and now he was trying to reconcile that version of Vanessa Cole with the one standing in front of him with frosting on her sleeve, and the two images refused to align in the way he expected. Across the room, a young associate leaned closer to her colleague and whispered something under her breath, the kind of whisper that travels farther than intended. And, though the words were soft, the tone carried, uncertain now, no longer confident in its earlier judgment, because something about Vanessa's stillness was beginning to rewrite the moment in real time. Ethan shifted his stance just slightly, the grin on his face lingering but no longer as certain as before, because the reaction he had anticipated had not arrived, and in its place was something he did not fully understand, a kind of calm that did not belong to someone who had just been embarrassed in a room like this, and he glanced briefly toward his parents, searching for confirmation that everything was still under control, that this was still just a joke, still just a moment that would pass without consequence. William Carter stepped forward at last, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit with a casual precision that suggested he believed this was still his space to manage. His voice smooth when it came, practiced in the art of minimizing what needed to be dismissed. And he offered a light chuckle, the kind that was meant to reset the tone of the room, to bring everyone back to a shared understanding that nothing serious had occurred, that this was simply an awkward but harmless moment. And yet even as he spoke, the room did not fully return to him, because too many eyes had already shifted back to Vanessa, waiting for something she had not yet given. Linda Carter took a slow sip of her drink, her gaze fixed on Vanessa with a smile that was polite on the surface but edged with something sharper underneath, the kind of look that measured people quickly and placed them into categories just as fast. And in her mind, the category had already been decided, a guest who had overstepped, by existing in a space not entirely meant for her, a presence that could be tolerated but not truly respected, and that belief had shaped her reaction as much as her son's action had. Vanessa finally lowered the napkin from her face, folding it neatly as if the gesture itself mattered, as if order in small things reflected something deeper, and she placed it carefully on the table beside her, not dropping it, not discarding it, but setting it down with intention, and then she adjusted the sleeve of her blazer where a faint mark remained, smoothing the fabric with a light touch that suggested she was not trying to erase the moment but simply restore herself to balance. And when she lifted her gaze again, it settled not on Ethan, not on Linda, but directly on William, and there was no hostility in it, no visible anger, only a clarity that felt more precise than any raised voice could have been. The music continued to play, but softer now, or perhaps it only felt that way because the room itself had drawn inward, every small sound becoming more noticeable, the clink of glass, the shuffle of shoes against polished floor, the quiet exhale of someone holding their breath too long, and in that narrowing space of attention, Vanessa's silence began to speak louder than anything anyone else had said, and the people in the room, whether they admitted it or not, could feel that whatever came next would not belong to them, because for the first time that night, control was no longer where they thought it was. William Carter held Vanessa's gaze for a moment longer than he intended, and in that extra second, something subtle shifted behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, but calculation. The kind that comes when a situation no longer follows the expected script, and he cleared his throat lightly as if to reset the rhythm of the room, as if he could still guide it back into something predictable, something safe, and he stepped closer with a practiced smile that had closed deals, smoothed over tensions, and turned awkward moments into forgettable footnotes for decades. His voice calm, measured, almost amused as he gestured casually toward his son, explaining it away with a tone that suggested this was nothing more than youthful energy, a harmless misstep in an otherwise perfect evening, and a few guests nodded instinctively, relieved to be given a narrative they could accept, something that allowed them to relax their shoulders and return to their drinks without confronting what had actually happened. But Vanessa did not follow that narrative. She did not accept the frame he offered, and that refusal was quiet but absolute. She listened without interrupting, her expression composed, her posture unchanged, and when he finished speaking, expecting perhaps a polite acknowledgement or at least a softening of the tension, she did neither. Instead she tilted her head just slightly, not in confusion, not in submission, but in a way that suggested she was examining something more closely, something beneath the surface of his words, and that small movement drew attention again, pulling the room back into her orbit without her raising her voice or demanding it. Ethan shifted again, his earlier confidence thinning at the edges, because the adults were no longer laughing the same way. The energy had changed, and he could feel it even if he could not name it, and for the first time since the moment began, he looked not at the crowd, not at his parents, but directly at Vanessa, searching for a reaction he could understand. But what he saw did not match anything he had expected. There was no anger, no embarrassment, no attempt to defend herself, only a steady presence that made his own actions feel suddenly louder in retrospect, more exposed than they had seemed seconds ago. Linda Carter set her glass down with a soft click against the table, her fingers tightening briefly around the stem before she released it, and she stepped forward just enough to stand beside her husband. Her smile still in place but now more controlled, more deliberate, as if she understood that something about this moment required precision, and she offered a brief remark, light in tone, suggesting that the evening should move on, that everyone should not dwell on something so small, her words carefully chosen to minimize without apologizing, to acknowledge without conceding, and a few guests nodded again, eager to follow that lead, because it was easier to accept that nothing meaningful had happened than to question the behavior they had just witnessed. But the room did not fully move on because Vanessa had not moved, and her stillness continued to anchor the moment in place, preventing it from dissolving into polite forgetfulness. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, it did not need to be, it carried clearly through the space because everyone was already listening, and she addressed William Carter directly, her tone even, her words precise, not rushed, not softened, simply stated, and in that clarity was something that cut deeper than any raised voice could have, because she was not reacting emotionally, she was responding deliberately, and that distinction changed everything. She did not mention the cake, did not describe the moment, did not accuse or defend. Instead, she spoke about timing, about meetings, about the importance of understanding. The people you choose to stand beside in moments that matter. And as she spoke, the meaning began to settle across the room, not all at once, but in layers as different listeners caught different parts of what she was saying, and William's expression shifted again, more noticeably this time, because he understood the language she was using, not the literal words but the implication behind them, the kind of implication that existed in boardrooms and contracts, in decisions that were never announced loudly but felt immediately by those involved. A guest near the back straightened his posture, suddenly aware that this was no longer a social moment. Not really, it had become something else. Entirely, something with weight, something that extended beyond the walls of this room, and the quiet that followed Vanessa's words was different from the silence before. It was no longer uncertain or awkward. It was focused, attentive, waiting not for laughter or dismissal, but for consequence, and in that shift, the balance of the room tilted in a way that could not be undone, because the people who had laughed just minutes ago were now watching the same woman with a different kind of attention, the kind reserved for someone whose decisions carry real impact, and for the first time that evening it was no longer clear who held the power. William Carter did not respond immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed, because a man like him was known for certainty, for filling silence before it had a chance to settle. Yet now he stood there measuring his words more carefully than before, his eyes fixed on Vanessa as if trying to determine how much of this moment she truly controlled, and for the first time that evening, the confidence that had defined his posture began to show the faintest signs of strain, not visible to everyone, but clear enough to those who understood power when they saw it shift. He offered a slight nod, slow and deliberate, acknowledging her words without agreeing to them, his voice lower when he spoke again, more controlled, as if he had recalibrated his approach, and he spoke about timing as well, about how important partnerships required patience, mutual respect, and the ability to move past misunderstandings, carefully choosing language that reframed what had happened, without directly confronting it, attempting to pull the moment back into negotiation territory where he felt strongest, where outcomes could be managed, where influence could still be applied. But Vanessa did not mirror his tone. She did not step into the space he created. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, grounded, composed. Her presence steady in a way that made his words feel like they were circling rather than landing. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm, precision, but now there was a sharper edge to it, not in volume but in clarity, and she shifted the focus entirely, moving away from the surface of the incident and into something deeper, something structural, speaking about alignment, about the invisible agreements that exist long before contracts are signed, about the difference between opportunity and respect, and how one without the other was never sustainable. A few guests exchanged quick glances, their earlier ease replaced with a growing awareness that this conversation was no longer social. Not even indirectly, it had become a live negotiation unfolding in real time, and the stakes, though not fully spoken, were beginning to reveal themselves through implication alone. Ethan looked between his parents again, his earlier grin now completely gone, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. Because the room no longer belonged to him, the joke had not landed the way he thought it would, and the adults were no longer laughing or dismissing it as easily. Instead they were listening, watching, and, in that shift, he could feel that something much larger than a simple mistake was taking shape, even if he did not fully understand what it was. Linda Carter stepped in again, this time with more intention, her posture straight, her expression composed but firm, and she spoke with a tone that suggested resolution, that suggested the evening should return to its purpose, that business would continue as planned, and she emphasized the importance of the following day, of schedules, of commitments. Already in motion, subtly reinforcing the idea that what had been set in place would not be easily undone, that momentum alone should carry things forward regardless of this moment, and several guests nodded reflexively, because they were accustomed to that logic, the idea that large decisions moved on rails once they began. But Vanessa did not acknowledge that momentum, she did not validate it. Instead, she allowed a brief silence to settle after Linda's words, a silence that stretched just long enough to draw attention again, and then she took a single step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, simply intentional, and that one step shifted the dynamic more than any raised voice could have, because it signaled movement, not retreat, not hesitation, but direction, and when she spoke, her words were fewer this time, more concise, as if everything unnecessary had already been stripped away, and she spoke not about what might happen, not about possibilities or adjustments, but about decisions, about the kind that are made quietly and then carried out without reversal, and though she did not raise her voice, the weight of what she was saying pressed into the room with unmistakable force. William's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in his composed exterior, because he understood now that this was no longer about smoothing over an uncomfortable moment. It was about control, about who defined the outcome, and for the first time that night, it was clear that he was no longer the one setting the terms. The music continued in the background, soft and distant, but no one paid attention to it anymore because the real shift had already happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively, and the room, filled with people who had built careers on reading moments like this, could feel it settling into place, the balance tipping, the center of gravity moving, and once it moved, it did not move back. The silence did not break this time, it deepened, settling into the corners of the room like something that refused to be ignored, and Vanessa did not rush to fill it. She let it stretch, let it press against every person standing there until even the smallest movements felt amplified, the shift of a shoe against marble, the faint clink of glass being set down too carefully, the quiet inhale of someone realizing they were no longer witnessing a social misstep but a turning point. William Carter straightened his posture again, trying to reclaim the center of the moment, his voice firmer now, less casual, more deliberate, and he spoke with the authority that had built his reputation, reminding the room and Vanessa of what was at stake, of timelines, of contracts already drafted, of the scale of what had been set in motion. He did not say the number out loud, but it was there, hanging between them, understood by everyone present, a deal large, enough to shift markets, to define quarters, to anchor futures, and in his tone was the expectation that something of that magnitude could not simply be undone by a moment, no matter how uncomfortable. A few guests nodded subtly, drawn back into the gravity of that argument, because numbers like that had weight, they carried their own kind of authority, and for a brief second it seemed as though the room might tilt back in his direction, as though logic and scale might override whatever had just occurred. But Vanessa did not respond immediately, and when she did not address the numbers at all, she did not challenge the scale, she did not argue the importance, instead she shifted the frame entirely, her voice calm, steady, almost reflective as she spoke about cost, not financial cost, but something else, something less visible but far more permanent. She spoke about what it means to attach your name to a room, to a partnership, to a set of values that reveal themselves. Not in prepared statements or scheduled meetings, but in unguarded moments, moments exactly like this one, and as she spoke, the meaning settled in a different way, not as a counterargument, but as a redefinition of what the real stakes actually were. Ethan lowered his gaze for the first time, his earlier bravado replaced by a quiet discomfort he could not hide, because the attention that had once felt like approval now felt like exposure, and he shifted his weight again, stepping slightly back, closer to his parents, as if distance might soften the reality of what he had set in motion. Linda Carter glanced at him briefly, then back at Vanessa, her expression tightening just enough to reveal that control was slipping, not entirely, but enough to matter, and she stepped forward once more, her voice sharper now, less polished, urging resolution, urging movement, emphasizing that the evening had been planned, that people were here for a reason, that business should not be derailed by a single incident, her words carrying a subtle urgency that had not been there before. Vanessa listened, her posture unchanged, and when Linda finished, there was a brief pause, a narrow window where the room seemed to hold its breath again, and then Vanessa spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that cut through everything that had been said. And this time she did not speak in general terms. She did not reference principles or abstract ideas. She spoke in direct, unmistakable language, and in that moment, the room understood that this was no longer a conversation about whether something could be repaired. It was about whether it would be. William's expression hardened, his jaw setting as the realization fully landed, because he could see now that the momentum he had relied on, the scale he had invoked, the authority he had projected, none of it was shifting her position. None of it was pulling her back into alignment, and for the first time that evening, there was no immediate response from him, no quick adjustment, no redirect, just a brief, undeniable pause. Around them, the guests who had once laughed now stood in a different kind of stillness, their attention fixed, their earlier assumptions dissolving as they recalculated what they were witnessing, because this was no longer about a mistake made by a boy or a reaction expected from a guest. It had become something far more consequential, a moment where respect, power, and decision intersected in real time, and as Vanessa's final words settled into the space between them, the weight of what was about to happen became impossible to ignore, not because it was dramatic, not because it was loud, but because it was certain, and certainty in a room like this was the one thing no one could pretend not to understand. No one spoke after that, not because they did not have anything to say, but because the moment no longer belonged to words, it belonged to something quieter, heavier, something that settled into the space between people and made even the smallest movement feel deliberate, and Vanessa stood there, not as someone waiting for permission, not as someone seeking agreement, but as someone who had already reached a conclusion long before anyone else in the room realized a decision was being made. The light from the chandeliers caught the edge of her cheek, now clean, now composed, and the faint trace of what had happened remained only as memory, not as stain, and she let her gaze drift once more across the room, not searching, not questioning, simply acknowledging, as if she were closing a chapter in her mind, one face at a time, one assumption at a time, and in that quiet survey there was no resentment, no visible anger, only clarity, the kind that comes when something reveals itself exactly as it is. William Carter shifted again, but this time it was different. There was no attempt to reclaim control, no immediate strategy forming behind his eyes, only a growing awareness that whatever leverage he believed he had was no longer enough, and he glanced briefly at the people around him, the same people who had laughed moments ago, now standing still, attentive, recalibrating their own positions in response to what they were witnessing. Because in rooms like this, power was not just held, it was observed, measured, and redistributed in real time. Linda Carter exhaled slowly, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, her earlier confidence replaced by something more measured, more cautious, and she reached for her glass again, not to drink, but to steady her hand, to anchor herself in something familiar as the unfamiliar unfolded around her. And she said nothing this time, because there was nothing left to frame, nothing left to soften. Ethan remained silent as well, his posture smaller now. His earlier certainty dissolved into something quieter, something closer to understanding, even if incomplete, and he kept his eyes lowered, not out of instruction, but because the weight of the moment had settled in a way he could not ignore. Vanessa finally took a slow breath, the kind that does not signal hesitation but completion, and she turned slightly, not away from them, but toward the room itself, as if acknowledging that this space, this moment, had served its purpose, and her hand moved lightly to the edge of the table beside her. Not gripping, not leaning, just resting for a brief second, a point of stillness before motion, and then she stepped back, one step, measured, deliberate, and that single movement carried more finality than anything that had been said. No announcement followed, no dramatic declaration, because it was no longer necessary. The decision had already settled into the air, understood without needing to be repeated, and the people in the room felt it, each in their own way, some with quiet recognition, others with delayed realization, but all with the same underlying awareness that something irreversible had just taken place. The music continued, soft and distant, but now it sounded almost out of place, like a memory from earlier in the evening that no longer matched the present, and a server resumed walking slowly along the edge of the room, unsure at first, then more certain, as if the world itself was beginning to move again after holding still for too long. Vanessa did not rush, she did not look back immediately, she simply adjusted the cuff of her blazer once more, a small, precise movement that restored everything to order, and then she began to walk, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady each step, quiet against the polished floor, and as she moved, the room parted almost without realizing it, people shifting slightly to create space, not out of instruction, but out of instinct, because something about her presence now demanded it. Behind her, no one called out, no one stopped her, because there are moments when words lose their place, when the only thing left is the understanding that has already been reached, and as she reached the edge of the room, the doors ahead reflecting the soft glow of the lights behind her, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was complete, the kind of silence that does not ask what happens next, because it already knows that what just happened cannot be undone. The doors closed behind Vanessa with a soft, controlled click that echoed more loudly than it should have, not because of the sound itself, but because of what it marked. An ending that had not been announced yet was fully understood, and for a moment, no one inside the room moved, as if the space needed time to adjust to her absence, to recalculate itself without the presence that had just shifted its entire balance. Then, almost imperceptibly, the room began to breathe. Again, but differently now, conversations did not resume the way they had before. Laughter did not return. Instead there were quiet exchanges, low voices, subtle glances, the kind that carry weight without drawing attention, because the people in that room were not strangers to consequence. They recognized it when it arrived, even if it came quietly. William Carter remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on the doors long after they had closed, his expression no longer controlled in the same effortless way, the confidence that once defined him now replaced by a tighter, more focused calculation, and he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone with a precision that suggested urgency, not panic, and he stepped slightly aside, lowering his voice as he spoke into it. His words quick, measured, asking for confirmation, for updates, for clarity on something that suddenly felt less certain than it had just minutes ago. Across the room, a man in a navy suit leaned toward his colleague, whispering something that made the other man's posture straighten immediately, their eyes shifting toward William, then back toward the doors because information was moving now, quietly but quickly, and those who understood how deals worked could feel the ripple beginning to spread. Linda Carter remained still for a moment longer, then turned slowly, her gaze scanning the room, not with the earlier confidence of a host, but with the awareness of someone reassessing her audience. And she offered a brief, composed smile to a nearby group, attempting to restore some sense of normalcy. But it did not land the same way, because the room was no longer looking to her for cues, it was watching for something else, something that had already begun to unfold beyond her reach. Ethan stood close behind them, silent, his earlier presence reduced to something almost invisible, his hands at his sides, his shoulders slightly drawn in, and he glanced once toward the doors as well, as if trying to understand how a single moment had extended so far beyond what he had imagined. But there was no clear answer waiting for him, only the lingering weight of what had already been set in motion. William ended his call, his jaw tightening as he lowered the phone, and for a brief second, the mask slipped, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the shift beneath it, and he turned back toward the center of the room, his posture straightening again, attempting to reassemble control, but the effort was visible now, no longer seamless, and he spoke to Linda in a low voice, the words too quiet to carry, but the tone unmistakable, firm, urgent, and she nodded once, her expression tightening as she listened. Around them, The guests who had once laughed were now repositioning themselves, some stepping away slightly, creating space not physically but socially, others checking their phones. Their expressions changing as messages appeared, because news, in circles like this, did not wait for announcements. It traveled through networks, through calls, through quick confirmations that linked one decision to another. Near the far end of the room, a woman in a tailored black dress glanced down at her screen, then back up at William, her eyes narrowing slightly as realization settled in, and she leaned toward the person beside her, whispering something that caused a subtle but immediate reaction, a shift in posture, a tightening of expression, because the implications were becoming clearer now, not just as a possibility, but as a reality. William looked up again, his gaze sweeping the room, and this time he saw something different in the faces around him. Not admiration, not easy alignment, but distance, calculation, the kind that appears when people begin to reconsider their positions in light of new information. And for the first time that evening, the room no longer felt like his, not entirely, because control, once assumed, had begun to fragment, not loudly, not dramatically, but in quiet, undeniable ways, and as the realization settled in, the absence of one person at the door became the most powerful presence in the room. William Carter moved quickly now, not with panic, but with the kind of urgency that comes when time is no longer an ally. His phone pressed to his ear again as he stepped farther from the center of the room, his voice lower, sharper, asking for confirmation that he already suspected he would not like, and the answer came not in words anyone else could hear, but in the subtle tightening of his expression, the slight pause before he responded, the shift in his posture that no longer tried to conceal the weight of what was unfolding. Across the room, more phones lit up, screens glowing softly against dimmed chandeliers, and one by one, the quiet murmurs grew, not loud enough to disrupt the space, but enough to change its texture, because information had moved beyond speculation, it had become fact, and fact carried a different kind of gravity, one that could not be dismissed or reframed. Linda Carter stepped closer to William this time, her composure still intact but no longer detached, and she spoke in a hushed tone, her words controlled but urgent, asking questions that did not need to be repeated aloud for their meaning to be understood. And when he turned slightly toward her, his response was brief, direct, and enough to shift the expression on her face from controlled confidence to something more fragile, something that revealed the edges of concern she had not shown before. Ethan watched them both, his silence deepening, his earlier distance replaced by a quiet awareness that this moment had moved far beyond him, and he looked once more toward the doors, not expecting them to open, but understanding now that what had left the room had taken something with it that could not be easily replaced. A man near the bar straightened abruptly as he read something on his phone, his eyes widening just slightly before he masked the reaction, and he leaned toward his companion, whispering quickly, the kind of whisper that carries urgency even when the words are soft, and within seconds, the ripple spread again, moving from one cluster of guests to another, not chaotic, not loud, but precise, like a current flowing through a system that had suddenly been rerouted. William ended his call and lowered his phone. Slowly, his gaze lifting to scan the room, and what he saw confirmed what he had just been told. The subtle shifts in posture, the quiet recalculations, the distance that had grown between him and the people, who had once aligned themselves easily with his presence, and for a brief moment, he stood completely still, not out of uncertainty, but because there was no immediate action that could reverse what had already begun. Linda placed a hand lightly on his arm, not for comfort but for grounding, and she leaned in again, her voice softer now, asking what could be done, what options remained, and he did not answer right away, because the truth, when it settled, did not leave much room for alternatives. Across the room, a woman who had earlier laughed now stood with her arms crossed, her expression thoughtful, distant, as she considered the implications not just for the Carters, but for herself, for her own connections, for the network of decisions that extended beyond this evening. Because in rooms like this, no moment existed in isolation, everything connected, everything carried forward. A server passed quietly along the edge of the space, tray steady, movements careful, as if aware that the room had shifted into something more fragile, something that required precision even in silence, and the music, still playing in the background, felt increasingly out of place, a remnant of an earlier version of the evening that no longer existed. William finally spoke, not to the room, not to the guests, but to Linda, his voice low, controlled and definitive, and though the words did not carry, the meaning did, because his posture changed again, not collapsing, not retreating, but adjusting, accepting, and that acceptance, quiet as it was, signaled something more final than any announcement could have. The realization moved through the room in layers, not everyone understanding at once, but enough to change the atmosphere completely, and the laughter that had once filled the space felt distant now, almost unreal, as if it belonged to a different night entirely, because what had replaced it was something far more enduring, the recognition that power had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a precision that left no room for doubt, and in that recognition, the room no longer needed confirmation. It simply understood that what had been lost would not be regained, not tonight, not tomorrow, not in any way that could restore what had already been undone. Outside, the night air felt cooler than it should have, or maybe it was just quieter, the kind of quiet that settles after something has ended without needing to be announced, and Vanessa stepped onto the stone walkway without breaking her pace, her heels making soft, measured sounds that echoed briefly before dissolving into the open space beyond the doors, and she did not look back, not out of defiance, not out of pride, but because there was nothing left behind her that required a second glance. The valet near the curb straightened slightly as she approached, recognizing her not from the spectacle inside, but from something else, something quieter, the kind of recognition that comes from knowing exactly who someone is without needing it explained, and he offered a respectful nod, his movements precise as he reached for her car, and she returned the gesture with a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, the kind that does not draw attention but does not dismiss it either. Behind her, through the tall glass doors, the lights still glowed, the silhouettes of people still shifting, but the energy had changed. It no longer spilled outward, it remained contained, as if the room itself understood that whatever had been lost inside it could not follow her out. Vanessa paused for a brief second beside the curb, not hesitating, not reconsidering, simply allowing the moment to settle fully, and she adjusted the cuff of her blazer once more. A familiar motion, small and precise, restoring everything to alignment. And in that gesture there was no trace of what had happened earlier. No visible reminder, only control. The kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and choosing not to move from it. The car pulled forward smoothly, its engine low and steady, and the driver stepped out quickly, opening the door with practiced ease, and as Vanessa moved toward it, the city lights reflected softly along the polished surface, creating a quiet contrast to the sharp brightness of the chandeliers she had just left behind, and for a moment, the world outside felt larger, more open, less confined by expectation. Inside the building, William Carter remained near the center of the room, his posture still upright, his expression composed, but the weight of the moment had settled into him in a way that could not be undone, and he glanced once more toward the doors, not expecting them to open, but understanding now what their closing had meant, not just for the evening, but for everything that would follow, and Linda stood beside him, her earlier certainty replaced by a quieter awareness, her gaze no longer scanning the room for approval, but fixed on something internal, something recalculating in real time. Ethan remained still, his silence no longer unnoticed, and for the first time, he looked not at his parents, not at the guests, but at the space where Vanessa had stood, as if trying to understand the absence itself, the way it had reshaped everything without raising its voice. Outside, Vanessa lowered herself into the car, the door closing softly behind her, sealing the quiet around her, and she exhaled once, not in relief, not in exhaustion, but in completion, the kind that comes when a decision has been made and carried through without compromise. And as the car pulled away from the curb, the building behind her grew smaller in the rear window, its lights fading into the distance, not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily, like something that no longer held relevance. The city stretched ahead, wide and alive, its rhythm uninterrupted, its lights steady against the dark sky, and Vanessa sat back, her gaze forward, not searching, not questioning, simply present, because the moment behind her had already resolved itself, not through noise, not through confrontation, but through something far more enduring, the quiet, undeniable weight of a choice made with clarity. And in that silence, there was no need for words, no need for validation, only the steady understanding that what had been taken lightly by others had Never been light at all, and now, finally, neither was she.